Hi everyone, Miss Nikki here. Welcome to our summary for Chapter 6. I'm going to go over a little bit about energy and enzymes and look at some of the figures from our book. First of all, we have to talk about energy a little bit. So we need energy in order to do any kind of work in the body or bring about any kind of change. So the change, they're talking about metabolism, right? To put things together or to break things apart. So we need energy to walk, to talk, to think, to breathe. And energy occurs in two forms. Usually we think of energy of motion. This is really called kinetic energy. But we also have potential energy, and this is the energy that's stored in food. So we're going to talk about cellular respiration at some point, and we're going to talk about how the food that we eat, like glucose, is broken down into ATP, which is what we're going to use for energy in the body. They have this nice figure for you. They're going to start talking about thermodynamics, which we'll get to in just a second. But they're showing you the sun here shines down on the plants and the grass, right? It releases heat, and then the animal consumes the food that's in the plant. The plant made the glucose for themselves, right? Plants don't make food for us. They make it for themselves to grow. But the animal eats the food, and then eating that food, the animal can change that potential energy in the food into mechanical energy or energy of motion to move. Here are the two definitions. So the flow of energy in an ecosystem can be explained by these two laws. One, energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it can be changed from one form to another. And then energy cannot be changed from one form to another without losing some of that usable energy. And usually we see this in the form of heat. Here we have an example. So we have a plant cell here, and this plant cell has chloroplasts and a vacuole. That's how I know it's a plant cell, also a cell wall. So we know that the two laws, first of all, we can change energy form, but we can't lose any energy, right? So we don't create or destroy energy, but we can change form. And if we do, some energy is lost as heat. So here we have the sun, and we have carbon dioxide and water. All three of these things are going to go into the plant cell, and the plant cell is going to make something called glucose, which they can then turn into ATP, which then they can use to do action inside the body. They also give off heat in the process because you cannot do 100% conversion from sun to glucose. So it's all still energy. We've gone from solar energy into this potential energy. We're storing energy in the bonds of glucose, and we're releasing heat in the process. How does this apply to animal cells? So here we have a muscle cell, animal muscle cell. So we intake food, right? Carbohydrate, that's glucose. So we take food in, and along with oxygen, it goes into the muscle cell, and then the muscle cell is going to generate ATP that we're going to use to do work in the body, and we also release some as heat. And this is critical for us because this heat released from your muscles is what maintains our body temperature at 89.6. One of the concepts that they want you to understand about ATP is that it can be reused. So here we have adenosine triphosphate. There are 3 phosphate groups. If I cut one of those phosphate groups off, right, I'm now going to have ADP. I only have 2 phosphates, and this one is kind of floating around. Then if I add, what's going to come out is energy. Sorry. So I have ATP. I have energy stored in these bonds. I cut the bond. I release energy. And then these are separate. I have ADP plus P. Now, if I add energy back along with ADP and P, then I can create ATP. So basically, these molecules can be used over and over again as energy transports. Sometimes people think of ATP as shuttling energy from one area of the body to another. Some examples of what we can use ATP for. So we can use it to do chemical work, basically to put molecules together, to synthesize macromolecules. We can use it to do transportation work. If we want to pump an ion across a membrane, we need ATP to do that. We can do mechanical work. So energy to make the muscles contract, to make the cilia, the hairs, the little hairs on a cell, to make them move, the flagella of the sperm cell. So ATP can do chemical work, transport work, and mechanical work. Here's an example for you inside muscle cells. So we have these myosin molecules, and they're going to reach up and grab these actin molecules, and they're going to pull. That's how we go from this long extended muscle, and then when we contract the muscle, it's shorter, and you can see the bulge in the arm there. So basically, these fibers reach up and grab the actin and pull it over, so we go from long to short or contracted state. You have to have ATP for this to occur. If you ever take anatomy and physiology, we'll go into this in great detail, but right now think of ATP. ATP is needed for all muscle action. It's also needed for all nervous cell transmission. So for your brain to talk to some part of your body, it requires ATP. I wanted to show you this metabolic pathway. This is a very linear example. We have lots of chemical reactions that happen inside the body, and they can have very diverse pathways. So this one's just a pretty simple. So we have A is the reactant. If enzyme 1 is present, then we create B, which is the product. But then if enzyme 2 is present, B is now the reactant. It drives the reaction, and we end up with C as our product. So what exactly do enzymes do for us? So we talk about the fact that they lower the activation energy necessary for a reaction to occur. So here we can see in blue, no enzyme. In orange, enzyme is present. So will the reaction occur if there is no enzyme? In some cases, yes, it's going to happen no matter what. But do you notice that we need a lot less energy if the enzyme is present? So how can enzymes do this? How do they require less energy? Or why do they allow reactions to occur with less energy? Well, basically what enzymes are going to do is help bring items together, cause some sort of change in the enzyme, and allow for reactions to happen more quickly. So here we have a substrate. The substrate is this, I should point out, this is the same thing as a reactant. If it binds to an enzyme, we call it a substrate. So if I say substrate to you, you should know there's an enzyme somewhere that's going to bind that item and cause some sort of action to happen. So you can see this substrate binds this enzyme, and if you notice the pocket, the active site, is very specific. So that's the only substrate that can fit into that active site of the enzyme normally. Then we have this enzyme substrate complex. It actually hugs the substrate and makes it easier for the reaction to occur. So basically we took this substrate, or you want to call it a polymer, and we broke it down into 2 monomers. So the opposite can happen as well. This is synthesis. I can take 2 substrates, they can bind the enzyme, form this complex, and bring these 2 items close enough together that a bond forms, and now we have a product. These enzymes are reusable. They can be used over and over again. Here's another image of what an enzyme looks like. Remember, enzymes are proteins. They were made from DNA instructions inside the cell's nucleus. Here's what an active site looks like, and here's the substrate binding, and you see how the enzyme kind of wraps around the substrate. They call this a conformational change in the enzyme, and it increases the ability of the reaction to occur. You can think of it as bringing the items closer together so that they have a better chance to react. So temperature and pH can affect how enzymes behave. So this one, it says the rate of the reaction as a function of temperature. So if it's cold, doesn't have very much reaction. If it's super, super hot, it doesn't have very much reaction. We want right about here. So enzymes function best at their optimal temperature, and different enzymes have different optimal temperatures. What do you think the optimal temperature would be for enzymes in humans? So hopefully you're thinking about our body temperature, 98.6, right? So most of our enzymes work well at that temperature. Then they're showing you an exothermic animal versus an endothermic animal. So exothermic, they rely on environmental heat. We've all seen the snake laying on the road to try to heat himself, or the turtle climbs up on the rock and sunning itself to warm up, right? So ectothermic animals require environmental heat, and they usually have low metabolic reactions. So they don't put things together and break things down as well. But what's good about low metabolic is you also don't have to have a lot of calories. So low calories needed. So endothermic, you have a regulated environment internally, right? And so you have, instead of low, you have high metabolism, and that requires high food intake. So temperature does depend on how well the enzyme will work in that environment. And then through natural selection, nature, we have some animals that use this to their advantage. Here's an example of pH. So proteins, and remember enzymes are proteins, can change due to temperature or pH. So temperature can affect an enzyme, pH can affect an enzyme. So here's our pH scale. This is 0 to 12. Pepsin is an enzyme of the stomach, and trypsin is an enzyme of your intestines. So you can see, remember this is acidic and this is alkaline. You can see that in the stomach we have a pH environment of about 2. So this enzyme works best at about pH 2. It can still work in this range, but it works best at 2. Your intestines have a pH of about 8. So this enzyme, where do you think it works best? At about 8. So you can have different enzymes in different parts of the body, and they're going to work best at their pH, the pH of that organ, where they're located, where they're released into. That's the pH that they're going to work the best in. The book wants to make sure that you understand that some enzymes are not activated at all. They're not active all the time. They have to be activated. So we don't want these enzymes just running around doing whatever they want, whenever they want. We want to tell them when we want them on and when we want them off, right? So we can turn them on and we can turn them off. So we can add or remove phosphates. So if I add a phosphate, or in some cases if I remove a phosphate, that'll cause the protein to be active. And hence, if that protein is an enzyme, that would be enzyme activity. We can cleave or remove part of it. Sometimes you have to remove part of the protein in order to make it active. And then sometimes there's things called cofactors, where some item has to actually bind, could be a vitamin, mineral. It has to actually bind to the inactive protein, and that will cause the protein to become active. So here they're trying to show you that active pathway, that metabolic pathway, where we have enzyme 1 binds with reactant 1 and you form B. And then if 2 is present, you form C, and so forth and so on. And then you can get to this end product. So we've gone through this whole cascade, this pathway. The end product will go back and bind to the first enzyme, and you can see this has changed the shape of the enzyme, and now we no longer have binding. So this is basically inhibition. So you can turn on, or you can signal back and say turn off. In the next few units, we're going to go over photosynthesis and cellular respiration in more detail, but I would start by knowing this equation. So photosynthesis is when we take energy, or not we, plants, right? When plants take energy, sunlight energy, solar energy, along with carbon dioxide and water, and they turn it into glucose and oxygen. So make sure that you understand this reaction. What did they make glucose for? The plants made glucose for food to grow, right? So plants want to grow, they make glucose. We just pick them out of the ground and eat them. This is the equation for cellular respiration. Sometimes people say it's the opposite of photosynthesis. So this time you're taking glucose and oxygen, you're breaking it down into carbon dioxide and water, and you're getting out energy. Except for this energy is going to be ATP energy. It's not going to be solar energy, right? Animals don't create solar energy. So here's the big picture. We've got the sun, chloroplasts along with CO2 and water are turning the sunlight into carbohydrate and oxygen. Then we take the carbohydrates and the oxygen through the mitochondria and we generate ATP and heat. So without the plants, we would be in trouble because they're our source of carbohydrates and oxygen. Yes, you can get carbs from other things, but the plants are the ones taking the sunlight and turning it into carbohydrates and oxygen. Okay, so we have cellular respiration, which is glucose plus oxygen turns into ATP, CO2, and water. That's cellular respiration. This happens in the mitochondria in both plants and animals. All right, in humans, we have respiration. In respiration, we're talking about gas moving. So let's just follow the gases. Here's oxygen. You breathe the oxygen in. The oxygen gets put into your bloodstream, and that becomes one of the nutrients that goes in to generate ATP. You also eat, and you're going to have glucose put into your bloodstream. So now we have oxygen in our bloodstream and glucose. Those are the nutrients that go into the mitochondria, and out comes ATP so that our cells can do work. What are also the byproducts? Water and CO2. Water, we can reuse it or we can release it as urine. What about the CO2? We put the CO2 back in our blood, back to our lungs, and then we breathe the CO2 out. All right, that's all I have for chapter 6. I'll get on the next chapters as soon as I can, and the summaries will be posted.